December 6, 1944. Snow drifted across the rail yards of Iowa, hissing softly against the steel wheels of a troop train. Inside the dimly lit cars, dozens of German women sat shoulder to shoulder, former auxiliaries, clerks, nurses, daughters of a Reich that was crumbling by the hour. They had been told what to expect: humiliation, cruelty, degradation. Propaganda whispered that capture by the Americans was a fate worse than death. When the doors screeched open, icy wind cut through their thin coats. They braced for shouts, for rifle butts striking their ribs. Instead, a young American soldier stood silently, a folded wool blanket in his arms. Behind him, smoke curled from a field kitchen. The air carried not only the sting of coal, but a fragrance so alien in wartime that it made them dizzy: cinnamon-baked apples and the faint sweetness of fresh milk warming in metal cans. Helene, 22, froze in place. It was the smell of her childhood kitchen of Sundays before ration cards and air raid sirens, when her mother baked pies from the orchard harvest. Her stomach clenched, but more than hunger, it was memory that ached. Could this be real? The women stepped down from the train into silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on snow. Fear warred with disbelief. Had they entered captivity or something more unsettling, a world where kindness itself could be the sharpest weapon? The journey to America had been a blur of fear and exhaustion. From the moment of capture in the ruins of Cherbourg, the women had been herded together: secretaries, nurses, radio operators, all stripped of weapons, rank and purpose. They had been marched to a French port where hulking grey troopships waited, guarded by GIs with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. The propaganda they carried inside whispered relentlessly, "Now you will pay. Now they will break you." The Atlantic crossing was brutal. Below decks, seasickness mingled with the stench of oil and sweat. Each crash of the waves against the hull echoed like artillery, rattling their nerves raw. Meals were thin broth and bread, but even here the guards did not curse or strike. They stood watch, silent, professional, almost bored. This unnerved the women more than cruelty would have. Cruelty they had prepared for. Silence, indifference, this was stranger. After nearly 2 weeks, land rose on the horizon: Boston. The skyline's towers and chimneys stood like monuments of steel untouched by war. To the German women it was a glimpse of another world. Where were the ruins, the rubble, the endless graves? The city seemed alive, abundant, as if war were nothing more than newspaper headlines here. At the docks, American MPs corralled the women into lines. They were fingerprinted, photographed and tagged. Yet the process felt more like factory routine than vengeance. The clerks stamped papers briskly, the guards offered curt directions. No one spat on them, no one shouted obscenities. A sergeant merely said, "Move along," in a flat tone. It was disarming in its very normality. Soon they were loaded onto trains bound west. Through frosted windows they watched the American countryside unfurl: endless fields, barns painted bright red, cattle fattened in snow-dusted pastures. Every sight was a shock. In Germany, farms had been stripped bare, livestock requisitioned, granaries emptied. Here food seemed to overflow from the land. Greta, the youngest of the group, whispered, "It looks like a fairy tale." Anneliese, the eldest, muttered back, "Appearances deceive. Remember what we were told." Night fell as the train rattled through Iowa. Finally, with a screech of brakes, it pulled into a small station beside rows of low wooden barracks ringed with barbed wire. Guards led them into Camp Algona. The women braced themselves. Surely here was where the mask of civility would drop. Instead, they encountered bureaucracy. Tables lined the entry hall where clerks issued each woman soap towels, clean underwear, and wool blankets folded into neat squares. A medical officer examined them briskly, checking throats, listening to hearts, inspecting for lice. It was clinical, not cruel. Some women wept in shame, but the doctor offered no insults, only a clipped "next." Then came the first true shock: the showers. Hot water poured from the pipes, steam curling into the air. Many of the women had not bathed properly in months, reduced to cold basins in ruined farmhouses. They scrubbed themselves with American soap that smelled sharp, almost medicinal. The filth of the journey washed away, but with it came confusion. Was this kindness or a preparation for interrogation? Afterward, clean and bewildered, they were herded into the mess hall. Long tables stretched under bare bulbs. The room smelled of bread and beef stew. They sat stiffly, waiting for the blow, the insult, the humiliation. Instead, metal bowls of thick soup were set before them, potatoes, carrots, chunks of beef, floating in rich broth. Alongside lay slices of white bread, soft and thick, and then impossibly a pitcher of milk. The women stared. In Germany, milk had vanished from tables long ago, reserved only for children, and the sick often watered down until it was barely more than cloudy liquid. Here before them was fresh, cold milk droplets of condensation running down the metal pitcher. Greta reached first. She lifted a cup, poured, and drank. The milk coated her tongue, cool and sweet. Tears ran down her face as she whispered, "It's real." Annalise slapped her hand down on the table. "Don't trust it, it's a trick." But her voice wavered. Even she could not disguise the way her eyes lingered on the pitcher. Helene sat frozen. The steam of stew rose into her face, rich with flavour she had not smelled in years. Her stomach twisted with hunger but also with fear. Why would the enemy feed us? What game is this? She forced herself to take a spoonful. The warmth spread through her chest, steadying her hands. It was too real to be theatre. Then, as if to drive the knife deeper, the door swung open. From the kitchen emerged a tray of pies, golden crusts dusted with sugar, their scent of cinnamon filling the hall. A local woman, an apron tied over her coat, carried them forward. She set them on the table and, in halting German, said softly, "For you." The women froze. The room was silent but for the hiss of steam and the pounding of hearts. Propaganda had promised chains, not pies. Torture, not cinnamon. Helene stared at the dessert. She remembered her mother's apple tree, the pies baked on autumn Sundays, the way the smell filled their home before the war. She felt her throat tighten. Her hand hovered over the fork, trembling. To eat felt like betrayal to her country, to her starving family, to the voice inside her that screamed resist. Yet not to eat was to deny herself the memory of being human. Around her some women dug in desperately, others turned away in shame. Greta laughed through her tears, crumbs falling from her lips. Annalise clenched her fists, muttering curses. Helene lowered her fork slowly, but could not take the bite. That night, as they returned to the barracks, the smell still clung to their fingers. Behind them, the kitchen windows glowed warm, filled with the smoke of pies cooling on racks. Ahead, the bunks waited clean, ordered, surreal. Helene lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hunger, gnawing less than confusion. The Americans had not broken them with force. They had broken them with normality, with abundance, with something as simple as milk and pie. And that was far more terrifying than any whip could ever be. The days in Camp Algona fell into a rhythm that was at once unsettling and strangely comforting. The women had expected chains and cages, yet what they encountered was order, unyielding, precise, and almost domestic in its discipline. At dawn, the clang of a bell rang through the frosted air. Guards moved through the barracks with clipboards calling names in flat, unhurried tones. The women stood stiffly by their bunks, hair still damp from hurried washes at the sink. Each name checked was followed by a curt nod, not a blow. They folded blankets into sharp angles, corners tucked neatly, beds aligned like soldiers on parade. The Americans called it hospital corners. To the German women it felt absurd at first. Why should their captors care about tidy beds? Yet soon they realized neatness was its own form of control, a ritual that gave structure to captivity. The barracks themselves were plain, long wooden huts with rows of double bunks. A cast-iron stove glowed faintly at the center coal, crackling as it fought the winter chill. Shelves lined the walls, each with a bar of soap, a towel, and a cup. Compared to the ruins of Europe, it felt clean, almost sterile. Yet the barbed wire outside the windows was a constant reminder this was not freedom, but a carefully managed illusion of it. Breakfast stunned them each morning. Bowls of oatmeal dusted with sugar, slices of toast, with butter, sometimes even jam, and always a glass of milk. In Germany, milk was reserved for infants and the ill. Here it flowed daily, almost carelessly. Greta, the youngest, drank hers, greedily, cheeks flushing with colour she hadn't had in months. Annalise pushed hers away, muttering that to drink it was to play into American hands. Helene sat between them, torn, sipping slowly, while guilt burned hotter than hunger. After breakfast, the camp divided into work details. Some scrubbed clothes in steaming vats, their hands red from soap. Others peeled potatoes in the kitchen where American cooks tried awkward German phrases, Kartoffelgut, and grinned when the women corrected them. A few tended the camp garden, raking soil that even in winter promised abundance. Helene was assigned to the library hut, where she discovered shelves of books, Goethe, Schiller, and even novels she thought long vanished. She ran her fingers over the spines in disbelief. "Prisoners are allowed to read," she whispered. Greta giggled, clutching a worn fairy tale book. To touch words that were not propaganda felt like touching freedom itself. Yet suspicion never left. Letters from home trickled in, red-stamped by censors. They spoke of hunger-bombed cities and siblings shivering without coal. Helene's mother wrote, "Your sister wastes away. We trade heirlooms for bread." Helene read those words after finishing a supper of stew, and bread and shame struck like a blow. Behind barbed wire, she was warm and full while her family suffered in the ruins. Survival felt like betrayal. The guards themselves were another puzzle. Most were young farm boys from Iowa, their accents thick, their manner casual. They barked orders when necessary, but often added please or thank you. One evening, a guard noticed Helene coughing and silently handed her a handkerchief. She stared at it as if it were a weapon. Kindness was more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty hardened the heart. Kindness cracked it. Evenings were quiet. After dinner, the women gathered in the barracks, some mending clothes, others writing letters. A single bulb glowed above, casting shadows across the wooden walls. Outside, the wind rattled the wire, but no bombs fell, no sirens wailed. The silence was eerie, almost unbearable. In Germany, nights had been filled with terror. Here, the absence of terror was its own kind of torment. Helene began keeping a diary on scraps of paper, dull pencil scratching late into the night. She wrote fragments, questions, warm milk, clean sheets, soap. Is this mercy or theatre? She hid the pages under her mattress, afraid of being mocked by her fellow prisoners more than by her captors. One evening, Anneliese confronted her. "Stop writing. Every word they give us is poison. Do not let it into your head." But Helene could not stop. The contradictions haunted her. The propaganda had promised brutality, yet here was order books, food and soap. Was it all a trick, or had her life before been the lie? The strangest moment came weeks later in the mess hall. Greta burst into laughter while eating a biscuit dripping with butter. The sound startled everyone. Laughter, real unguarded laughter inside a prison camp. Helene stared, her fork frozen in midair. In Germany, laughter had been smothered by hunger and fear. Here, behind enemy wire, it had returned. That night, Helene lay awake, listening to the quiet breathing of the barracks. She pressed her pencil to paper one last time before blowing out the lamp. If mercy is also a weapon, it cuts deeper than any blade. Sunday mornings carried a different rhythm in Camp Algona. Roll call was shorter guards, more relaxed, and whispers of something unusual spread through the barracks. That week, the rumor reached Helene, women from the local church were coming. No one knew what that meant. Anneliese warned it was a trick. They'll try to soften us, make us forget who we are. Greta, wide-eyed, hoped it meant fresh bread. By mid-morning, the mess hall filled with the smell of wood smoke and boiling coffee. The women filed in stiff as ever, uniforms washed pale by weeks of laundering. They sat at long tables, bowls already, waiting with oatmeal toast and butter, but soon the door swung open and silence fell. Local women from the nearby town stepped inside aprons tied over winter coats. In their hands they carried trays, and from those trays rose a fragrance that seemed to warp time itself, apple pie, golden crusts dusted with sugar, the air heavy with cinnamon. Behind them came farm boys, balancing metal pitchers of milk, beads of condensation sliding down the sides. Helene felt her chest tighten. The smell struck like a memory blade, her mother at the kitchen stove, the orchard behind their home heavy with fruit Sundays when laughter was still possible. She clenched her hands under the table. No, this cannot be real. Not here. Not from them. The pies were cut into wedges placed on chipped white plates. Steam curled upward as knives slid through crust, releasing the sweet tang of baked apples. A slice was set before each prisoner. Beside it, a cup filled with cold, fresh milk. The women stared frozen. The propaganda had promised lashes, not pie, chains, not cinnamon. Greta broke first. She gripped her fork, hands trembling, and took a bite. Crumbs fell onto her lap as tears spilled freely. "It tastes like home," she whispered in German, her voice shaking. She lifted the cup of milk and drank deeply as if she could swallow the memory of childhood whole. Annalise pushed her plate away, jaw clenched. "Do not touch it. This is their weapon. They want to see us beg." Her words were hard, but her eyes betrayed hunger lingering on the steam that rose from the pie. Helene stared down at her plate. Her fork hovered. The crust glistened under the lights, golden and delicate. The smell was overwhelming. Her throat burned. To eat felt like treason to her starving family, to the ideology she had been raised in, to the voice that said endure, resist. But not to eat was its own betrayal. Denying herself would not feed her sister back in Germany. Denying herself would not make the war shorter. Her hand shook. She pressed the fork through the crust. It cracked with a crisp sound that echoed in her mind louder than any gunshot. The first bite flooded her mouth with flavors she had nearly forgotten: tart apples, warm spice, buttery sweetness. Tears blurred her vision. For a moment she was no longer a prisoner, no longer an enemy. She was simply Helene, daughter of a baker's wife, tasting her mother's kitchen again. The milk followed, cold, rich, impossibly clean. It washed away the sting of salt from her tears, coating her throat with a comfort she had not known in years. She gripped the cup tightly as if afraid it would vanish. Around her the room was a patchwork of reactions. Some women ate silently, tears streaming. Others refused, fists clenched on their laps. A few stared in fury at their comrades, calling them weak, corrupted. But none could escape the smell, the memory it stirred. The air was thick with a grief sharper than hunger, grief for the years stolen, for the homes destroyed, for the truth that mercy could wound more deeply than cruelty. One of the church women, grey-haired, paused beside Helene. She said nothing, only offered a small, tired smile before moving on. That smile unsettled Helene more than interrogation ever could. There was no hatred in it, no superiority, just humanity. After the plates were cleared, silence lingered like a fog. The women filed out, their faces haunted. Some whispered prayers of thanks, others curses. Helene walked in silence, the taste of cinnamon still clinging to her tongue. That night, lying on her bunk, she stared at the ceiling. She tried to summon the slogans she had memorized: America is decadent, cruel, godless. But the words sounded hollow against the memory of warm pie and milk. She pressed her hand to her lips as if to hold the taste inside forever. Her diary page that night contained only one line: mercy is more dangerous than the whip. For in that moment she understood the enemy had given her not pain but a memory of home, and that was enough to unravel years of belief more effectively than any weapon of war. The weeks after the apple pie became a turning point. Something subtle had cracked inside the barracks. The propaganda that once bound the women tightly now began to fray, thread by thread, undone, not by force but by the quiet persistence of abundance. Camp life settled into steady rhythm. Roll calls, work details, inspections, monotonous, predictable. Yet around the edges of routine, the women encountered fragments of America that gnawed at their convictions. In the small camp library, Helene found shelves stacked with books, novels, poetry, even German classics. At first she ran her fingers across the spines without daring to read, half expecting a trap. But curiosity overcame fear. She picked up a thin volume of Goethe and read by the light of a coal stove. Why would enemies give us our own literature? The thought haunted her. Soon came English classes. A chalkboard was propped up in a spare barrack, and a corporal with spectacles scrawled simple words: bread milk, home. The women laughed nervously, whispering that they already knew enough English to curse their guards. But Helene stayed. She mouthed the words softly, tracing their shapes with her pencil. Writing milk in a foreign tongue while still tasting it each morning carried a strange power. Greta excelled quickly, even daring to practice phrases with the guards who grinned at her attempts. Annalise refused, muttering that it was surrender. Evenings brought film reels. In the mess hall, benches were lined up and a projector clattered to life, spilling grainy images on a white sheet. The films showed American farms heavy, with crops factories glowing with molten steel women in coveralls assembling bombers. Sometimes newsreels flickered images of German cities reduced to rubble. The women watched in silence, jaws clenched. For some, it confirmed their fears, proof of America's overwhelming power. For others, it was revelation. Helene stared at the screens, unable to reconcile the vision of America as brutal monster with the reality of humming farms, dancing couples, and children licking ice cream. The contradictions deepened with each day. Newspapers circulated through camp, printed in both German and English. Some were official bulletins, others were camp newsletters written by the prisoners themselves, filled with poetry, jokes, even editorials. Helene read them in secret, fascinated by how freely opinions flowed. Back home, censorship cut everything sharp. Here, even within barbed wire, words seemed freer. Conversations in the barracks shifted. The hardliners warned constantly, "Do not believe it. Every kindness is bait." But even they could not stop their eyes from lingering on plates of eggs at breakfast, on the bars of soap replaced, before they wore thin on the steady rhythm of life unmarred by violence. Slowly, doubt took root. Helene's diary filled with conflicted lines. One night she wrote, "If they lied to us about America's cruelty, what else have they lied about?" The thought chilled her. It was not betrayal to admit hunger, it was betrayal to admit that propaganda itself might be false. Yet the question refused to leave. Guilt, however, was never far away. Letters from Germany spoke of starvation, bombings, despair. One arrived from Helene's mother, "Your sister is skin and bone. Coal is gone. We burn furniture for heat." Helene read it while sipping hot coffee in the mess hall, steam curling around her face. She wanted to throw the cup away, to spit it out, but instead she drank and wept silently. To live well as a prisoner while family suffered felt obscene. The guards, meanwhile, blurred the lines further. Some were stern, but others shared casual jokes, even music. One evening, a phonograph crackled to life in the recreation hut, playing swing records. A group of American guards and German prisoners sat together, tapping their feet. For Helene, it was unbearable and intoxicating all at once. Enemies should not share rhythm. Yet she could not deny the way her fingers drummed on the table in time with the beat. The camp doctor added another contradiction. When Greta caught a fever, she was treated with care. Blankets were doubled, aspirin provided, and the doctor checked her temperature daily. Greta recovered swiftly. In Germany, such medicine was scarce, even for civilians. Helene remembered hospitals back home where wounded men begged for morphine that never came. Here, the enemy gave it freely. By spring, the ideological cracks widened into fissures. Some women practiced English daily, writing letters of thanks to local townsfolk who brought food or books. Others held firm, cursing their comrades as weak. Barracks arguments broke into shouting lines drawn between those who clung to the Reich's vision and those who admitted that something about America, its order, its abundance, its relentless normality, was changing them. Helene lived between those worlds. She felt shame every time she laughed, every time she savored food. But she also felt the walls inside her mind shifting. If America was not the beast she had been taught to hate, what else had been lies? Could kindness be as much a weapon as bombs? One night she sat with her diary and wrote slowly, "If mercy could exist here, maybe it existed all along, and we were never told." She stared at the words until her eyes blurred. To admit such a thought was treason. Yet the taste of apple pie and the cold sweetness of milk lingered undeniable, like ghosts of a truth she could no longer suppress. And so belief faltered. Not with gunfire, not with interrogations, but with cinnamon soap, books, and music. The Reich had promised eternal loyalty. Instead, its daughters were unraveling within the barbed wire of a camp where the greatest danger was not cruelty but mercy. The announcement came in the summer of 1945. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. In the barracks of Camp Algona, a hush fell as the words spread, quiet at first, then rippling into whispers, then tears. For months, the women had lived in a paradox: prisoners fed, clothed, and sheltered more generously than their families back home. Now the fences that had once kept them in would soon open, and the reality they had tried to forget came rushing back. They would return to ruins. The journey back mirrored their arrival, but in reverse. The train rolled east through fields heavy with corn, through towns untouched by bombs, through landscapes of abundance that mocked their memories of Germany's barren streets. From the port ships carried them across the Atlantic. The voyage felt shorter this time, though dread stretched every hour. The women crowded the rails, staring at the ocean, trying to imagine what waited. When Helene set foot once again on European soil, the air was sharp with dust and smoke. The first towns they passed were hollowed shells, walls gutted by fire churches reduced to skeletal spires. In place of the clean order of Algona's barracks were refugee camps, children in rags, begging by the roadside mothers clutching empty tins. Hunger clung to every face. Helene found her family home, half-collapsed roof beams charred. Her mother stood thinner than she remembered, eyes sunk deep, hands raw from scavenging. Her younger sister, once rosy-cheeked, was skeletal, her dress hanging like a rag. Helene dropped the American blanket she had carried home, suddenly ashamed of its thickness, its warmth. Neighbors whispered when they saw her. Prisoner in America. Some looked with envy, others with suspicion. Rumors spread. They ate meat there. They drank milk. They lived better as prisoners than we did free. A young man sneered. "You sold yourself for pie." Helene could not answer. How could she explain that it was not betrayal but survival? How could she confess that the taste of cinnamon and milk had saved her soul when bombs could not at night? Hunger gnawed louder than silence. Coal was scarce, breadlines endless. Helene tried to recreate what she had once been given freely. With scraps of flour, a shriveled apple, and watered-down milk, she baked a pie. The crust was thin, the filling sour, but when her sister tasted it, a faint smile lit her face. For Helene, it was both redemption and torment. Every bite carried memory, the abundance of America, the shame of Germany's collapse, the knowledge that mercy had come from the enemy, not her homeland. The lessons of the camp clung stubbornly. She folded her bed each morning with hospital corners, a ritual that drew puzzled glances. She scrubbed her hands with soap before cooking, teaching her sister that hygiene mattered even in ruins. These small acts of order were her secret inheritance, smuggled across the ocean like contraband. But the weight of memory never left. When neighbors mocked her for speaking a few English words, she flushed with shame. When her mother asked about America, Helene lied, saying little. To speak truth, that prisoners had eaten better than civilians, that guards had shown kindness, that she had once wept over a slice of apple pie, felt impossible. It was a secret she guarded as fiercely as her diary hidden deep among the rubble. Years later, when life in Germany began slowly to rebuild, Helene still carried the paradox in her heart. She was a survivor, but also an exile of the mind. She had lived in a cage, and yet that cage had offered warmth when her homeland could not. She had returned to freedom, yet that freedom was filled with hunger and suspicion. Every time she smelled cinnamon at a market stall, her throat tightened. Every time she saw milk froth in a pitcher, she remembered Greta's tears and Annaliese's clenched fists. For the rest of her life, those simple tastes, pie and milk, remained more haunting than the sound of air raid sirens. Captivity had ended, but its lessons had not. The mercy of the enemy had carved itself into her memory, deeper than bombs, deeper than propaganda. And in post-war Germany, where pride and shame tangled daily, she carried that memory silently, both a wound and a salvation. Years later, Helene sat by a kitchen window in a rebuilt Germany, the ruins slowly replaced by schools, shops, and quiet streets. She sprinkled cinnamon over a modest pie, its crust uneven but fragrant, and poured milk into a chipped glass. The scent rose like a ghost from the past, carrying her back across an ocean, back behind the barbed wire of Camp Algona. Food had been more than sustenance in those years, it had been language. A slice of apple pie spoke louder than 1,000 propaganda leaflets. A cup of milk silenced years of fear more effectively than any interrogation. The Reich had promised its daughters that America was cruel, merciless, inhuman. Yet in captivity, Helene discovered something more dangerous than cruelty-mercy. The irony never faded. They had expected whips and chains, yet were given soap, blankets, books, and food. They had braced for humiliation, and instead received kindness that gnawed at their loyalties more than punishment ever could. Soft power had done what steel could not. As she lifted the fork to her lips, Helene asked herself the same question that had haunted her since 1944. If mercy could exist even in war, what else had been possible all along? The camera lingers on her hands, aged now but steady as mate. She breaks the crust and takes a bite. Outside, the world moves on. Inside the memory of cinnamon and milk lingers both a wound and a reminder that humanity can survive even the darkest hours.